All right, internets, welcome to another episode of Step Off Radio, the official podcast of Step Off Magazine. Internets, we got an incredible guest on the show today. She is an educator, she is an artist, she is a professor at the Baruch University of New York. Please, everybody, welcome Dr. Lizbeth de la Cruz Santana. Thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, yeah, of course, it's been nice. I listened and watched the previous one too, so it was really nice to see like how it all goes down and everything.
Oh,
yeah,
no, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you on here. So for our listeners, we always ask our guests when they come on here. So for our listeners that may not be familiar with you and your work, please tell us a little bit about yourself. What is it that you do, where are you from, and what brings you here on the show today?
Yeah, so my name is Lizbeth. I go by Liz. I was raised in California, specifically between Compton, and then my family decided to move to Jalisco for several moments. So that's where I got my both sides of the border type of thing, like identity. So I do feel like I'm very more Mexican than U.S. American, just because I grew up more used to my family's culture. But then eventually life took me to New York City, which is something that I never planned about to do, but it's cool to be there right now. We'll see what happens.
Absolutely, the city that never sleeps, as they say. But actually, that leads us right into our next question. So, a little bit about like your history growing up. So, my understanding is that you were born here in California, but you spent some time in Jalisco. Yes. And I wanted to ask you about that. Tell us a little bit about those influences growing up. I wanted to ask, were you raised in a politically active or engaged household, and
Right, yeah.
Because I feel like there is, as people of color, as Latinos, whatever we identify as, our existence, whether we like it or not, is politicized, right, especially when we're traveling from both sides of the border. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about those experiences.
Yeah. Well, I grew up always crossing the border with my parents, right? So it's my mom, my dad, my brother. So I'm the oldest of three. And even crossing the border through Tijuana, it was an interesting experience because my dad looks a certain way, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like a brown male, driving like a van to begin with, right? And we would always get sent to secondary inspection coming back into the U.S., right? Or like the things my parents would always tell us when we're crossing, like pretend that you're sleeping, first of all, so you don't talk. And then the second thing is carry your high school ID at the moment we were already in high school, or just pretend or act like U.S. Americans. So I quickly learned that we were different. And even though I was born here, it was very hard to kind of assimilate to the idea of that. I had to understand that I didn't belong in the U.S. fully because at the end of the day, my parents are immigrants, right? So, and in Mexico, the same thing. I don't fully belong because I wasn't born there. Mm-hmm. But I spoke Spanish. I went to school there too. So it was always a contrast, right, of where do I fit in? And for me, that's where I gravitate towards border studies because of that. But again, my dad was always active in his community. That's why we would always go back to Mexico. He was part of a club called Pluma Escala, which helped pave roads and do all different type of things in his pueblo, which the government wouldn't do, right? Or the municipio, which is the closest government there. Mm-hmm. And that's where I realized, I was oh, this is cool. And I was young. I was little, elementary. I was doing the flyers for them and things like that. So that's where I realized I could participate, even if it's on the smaller technical things. But I did see my dad more full on, talking to upper ups and people who knew what to do. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was interesting to see and witness. And I think it helped me facilitate the fact that I know that, you need different people on board to accomplish something. And now that I go back to Mexico, where my parents are from, now I see the roads and as an idea that was back then, and now it's there, right? Yeah. So you see the product ending, right, and people from the town benefiting from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. How long did you live down there for?
So different moments. So 2000s for sure, but even before that, my parents would always go back and forth. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's just how migration works, right? They don't have enough money in the U.S. to survive, we go back. But the one time I do remember 2000s, the world was gonna end kind of thing. So for some reason, they bought us our last Christmas gifts, and for me it was a computer that spoke English. So I took that with me, and that was the only thing I took from my stuff in the U.S. And then, so I grew up there for a while, 8 months, almost a year, and then we would just go back and forth. Mm-hmm. But it was mostly childhood, not adult,
Okay. Mm-hmm. One thing that is a common theme for a lot of our guests on this show is that, as you spoke to, there's this feeling of not belonging to either side of the border, you know, and like the quote that I always quote is, you know, from Salina. They say, you know, like for Chicanos, you have to be more American than the Americans, more Mexican than the Mexicans. You know, can you speak to your experience a little bit about that?
Right. And, you know, I like to also bring in Becky G to this because she talks about the being 200%er, right? And when I heard that, it's like, yeah, you are 100% U.S. American, you are 100% Mexican. So it's just being Chicano means that you're 100 of each, right? Not half of one or half of the other.
Yeah.
So when I heard that, I was like, wow, that she's right. Because I always felt like I was U.S. American, but I obviously gravitated towards more of the Mexican culture. And in Mexico, same thing. I was like, this is who I am, right? But I was born here. So I think that experience allows me to have more richness in like what I could like listen to in music, languages. I like to read, so same thing, right? Like what I can view, read, especially as a teacher or professor or whatever you want to call it. It's like you have more things to grab from versus just being U.S. American. I think I would be bored if I was just U.S. American.
Exactly.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, because you know, being bilingual, you know, and also, you know, and binational too, it opens you up to like, you know, arts and culture and film and a whole plethora of other, you know, mediums, you know, politics even too.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, I follow like Mexican politics too because of my dad, and then, you know, just U.S. stuff because it affects us here.
Yeah, absolutely, and it just makes you a more worldly person. In your bio, when I was doing research for this episode, it says that, you know, these experiences traveling back and forth that would spark your interest in approaching, you know, migrants as, you know, knowledge producers, but, you know, thinking that, you know, that not only do they just add and bolster, but also can, you know, challenge, you know, our kind of, you know, our consensus on, you know, political and, you know, educational orthodoxies. I want to ask, you know, like, was there like an aha moment when you realized, you know, this is what I want to get into, like in terms of, you know, academia and becoming a professor and teaching?
Well, there was different moments. One specific one that I remember is my grandpa, my mom's dad, because we lived by the house, right? So my mom and my dad bought a house right next to my grandparents' house. So I grew up next to that experience, right? Like the grandparents nearby, and everyone was family in that small ranchito, right? So I remember my grandpa came in with like different, like I was gonna say like ceramic dolls or something like that, like very old, like antiques, because they had gone to some like small cave somewhere in Mexico, so they found things like artifacts. Okay. So they came back. Being Mexican man, they started drinking tequila and whatever they started doing, and my grandpa got drunk. But there was a professor there with them, and I know he was doing archaeology. That's all I remember. But I was like young, like smaller, like than 5 years old. So, but I still remember that. So I remember the dolls lined up, and then my grandpa went inside. I'm telling you, he's drunk. You know what I mean? And he's just doing his thing. And then we were just playing, and then by the time we all come back to the same spot where the dolls were, which was at the entrance, everything was gone, except for like a smaller doll that was broken. So this professor stole these artifacts that, you know, my grandpa found along with like one of my cousin's dad. So I think for me that was kind of like, wow, like people can come in, take from people, like steal from them. This was something my grandpa was like very proud of because he would research, right? So he wanted to be a teacher when he was younger, but he couldn't. My dad was very interested in this too. So just kind of having that opportunity to witness someone stealing from the community and then just God knows where they're at. Yeah. You know, and I'm like, I always wonder, like, where are these things at, right? So the one that we saved, we have it at home in Fresno. So that's it. That's all we have left, right? So that moment for me was just kind of like an invitation to start thinking more about why do people do this? What's so important about these artifacts that you're finding? Because for us, I was young, and it was just like, oh, these are dolls. Yeah. And then I went to Jalisco to, what was it called? It's like a new place by Guadalajara that they found, Huachimontones. And I saw many of these dolls there, and I was like, oh, this is what my grandpa had found, like something similar to that. So again, you know, like you're young, but you remember moments. But again, having access to a language for me was important. So speaking Spanish, and not just any type of Spanish, but proper Spanish was like great, right? Because I could talk to my family members, and then I don't have to like borrow words in English. So when I go to Mexico, it's just straight up Spanish. Yeah. And then, you know, because I want to make sure that they don't feel like I'm out here, you know, imposing on them. So that's why I study Spanish literature and culture too. So that's my path, right? Like access to the richness, you know, that maybe my family didn't read or anything like that. But I think for me, it was just kind of an invitation to learn more about who they are and like where they come from.
Gotcha. So this is something from a very early age.
Yeah, that was little. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, because like I always like to ask people like what their there seems to always be like a moment that sticks out in everyone's mind when they're like, no, this is important. This is something that like I want to dedicate my life to, you know. So thank you for sharing that about yourself. You're actually kind of leading into like, you know, like you said, you know, speaking like proper Spanish, you know, and having that down to a T. A little bit about your education. So like, you attended, you know, California State University, Fresno, where you earned your master's degree in Spanish language and literature. And then from there, you got your PhD from UC Davis, which also in Spanish and does an emphasis in human rights. I'm just going to come on and say, you know, you're easily like the most educated and well-read person that we have ever had on this show. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about like your experiences on campus and what was it like being a first-generation Latino college student. But even before that, though, this is kind of a two-part. You know, what were your experiences like in school? Did school come easy to you, and you know, did you feel supported, you know, and represented when you were here in California?
Right. Yeah, because all my schooling is in California, like the public school system, K through 12. Even though I did schooling in Mexico, which, you know, I kind of feel weird saying that out loud too, because I feel like school in Mexico was more advanced. Because I finished school there, 3rd grade, I believe. Then we came back, and then, you know, I was like higher advanced in like math. And I get here and they're like, oh, she could be in 4th grade. And I told my parents, no, like I want to stay with the kids in my age, you know, because you don't want to feel weird. You already feel weird because you came from another country, even though you were born here, you know, like assimilating. Yeah. All of those things, like learning English again, right? So, I mean, it was just a lot. I'm like, I don't want to add that age thing.
A lot of layers, it seems like, yeah.
And then being the oldest, and you know what I mean? All these little things, I was just like, it's going to be hard. So I remember I just told them to just stick me where I'm supposed to go. And yeah, so I mean, the school system in the U.S. has been good, K through 12 for me at least, right? I've always been like the smart one in my family, or like just working for it, because I saw my parents struggle. Still to today, they still do. But then, I mean, they don't know, I mean, my dad knows English, but they don't, you know, they didn't help me with my homework because they couldn't, especially my mom, right, which was mostly with me the whole time. And I remember like growing up in Compton, going to the laundromat and like washing and things like that. And then I'm struggling with my homework because, I mean, first time I'm seeing this material right outside of the class. And it's like, I can't even ask my mom. You know what I mean? Like, I'm the oldest, I couldn't even ask my siblings either, right? So it's kind of like, you have to try harder, because if you don't do it, then who will? Yeah. Right? And yeah, so I always remember those moments, right, of just kind of like, well, I need to do it myself. So I would always be very like attentive in class and just kind of like paying attention, because if I didn't, then who would? Who, exactly. Like, you know what I mean? We didn't have cell phones back then. To be like, hey, remind me what we're supposed to do. It's like, you have to do it yourself. But I've always liked school. So I think that helps, yeah.
It definitely helps when like school has always like come easy to you, and like, so like you've always been like a proficient in everything.
Yeah, but I feel also it's like a safe haven kind of thing.
Really? How so?
Me, like for school, because I feel like coming back and forth between Mexico and the U.S., and then like my parents splitting up and all of these things, that's hard on a kid. You know what I mean? Like whatever age you're at. So I think for me, school was like, I knew what to do. You know what I mean? There was an order at school. Yeah. Does that make sense? You show up at this amount at this time, and you do it for X amount of hours, and school ends here. You have support, right? Like, I mean, teachers. I mean, I do it with my students too. Like, you see students that really want something else. Yeah. So you gravitate towards, or they gravitate towards you, and you kind of guide them and mentor them. So that's what happened with me. Right? Okay. Like I had like specific teachers who were like, oh, I think she wants something more. How do I help her? Yeah. Yeah.
To kind of follow up on that question, because like you said that you're the oldest of three siblings, and another thing that I've noticed, just like in my own family, like amongst like my tias or like my cousins and stuff like that, when you're the oldest, especially when you're a woman and you're the oldest sibling, you kind of get designated as mom 2.0 in the family. Is that a similar experience that you experienced in your family?
Yeah, that's what happened to me, right? Because I mean, I didn't ask for it. Just, you know, you kind of had to pick up on that, because either my parents or my mom was working like all the time, even when we were with my dad. So I mean, I had to, right, like pick up on that role, or just like support, I guess. But then I realized I had to step down from that when my brother didn't graduate high school on time. Right? And I was like, if that was, I felt like I failed. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because he didn't graduate on time. And I was like, what thing did I do wrong? Because I graduated with honors and all this good stuff, right? And then my sister, she did good. And then it was my brother, and I was like, what happened here? So I took it on myself. My mom and my dad were like more calm about it. I was like, no, this is not good. You know what I mean? Because he has a good example. That's what I always tell them. And then that's when I realized I have to be a sister, not a mom, to my brother. So I was like, do your summer school thing. It wasn't his fault either. So I understand the system, impacts more, like, and how it like hurts males. So I was just like, you know what? As long as he graduates, that's it. Like, that's it. But that's when I had to like switch over. I was like, oh, I can't be his mom anymore, because then I'm losing out and having that sibling relationship because you're picking up on.
Was that difficult?
Oh my God, yeah. It was. But then after that, I'm just like, even still to today, I tell my mom, you tell him, not me. You know what I mean? Like, you do it, not me, because it's not fair.
You have to do the momming.
Yeah. But it's part of the process, you know what I mean? Because it's like, if I could choose to be the middle child or the youngest one, I'm glad I'm the oldest. Because then I'll be depending on someone. I'm like, God, I don't know about that.
Hey, there you go. Yeah. I mean, I'm the oldest of my siblings too. Like, I kind of feel like as the oldest, like you're kind of the experiment child. Your parents are always the first to deal with you and everything. So.
But I did good. So I think that's where my parents were like, oh, okay, we did good. You know what I mean? Yeah. But still, like, life happens. And we grew up in places like Compton, Linwood, so it wasn't easy either at least for my brother. Actually.
I was gonna say, so like I know that your family kind of went back and forth. What was it like growing up in Compton, like in like the 90s and the early 2000s? Because I think right now we kind of have a way of romanticizing the 90s, and I get it, throwback, everything like the music, but like people forget that growing up in places like Compton and South Central, and other major cities in the 90s is a lot different than it is now.
Oh yeah, like I drive through, every time I go through LA or Linwood or visit family, I go through where we used to live, and I'm just like, damn, like this is different. It's different. It's a whole different feeling. But I mean, I could tell you. I mean, we walked to school, like elementary school, like the three of us, and then we would see pimps on the street, police undercover. So that's where I was like, wow, there's like women out there in the police force, dressing up, acting like they're prostitutes, right? And then that's how they get the guys. I mean, I grew up knowing that. Yeah. So for me, it was just kind of like you knew that they were there, even undercover or like very visible. You just navigate them. Navigate your life around them.
You grow up very fast in an environment like that.
Yeah. Even in I remember my middle school, that's where I was introduced to like why you shouldn't wear red, right? And things like that. And I'm just like,
you can't wear certain caps. No Raiders, no Yankee caps.
So for me, that was kind of like, I understand why, but you're imposing something on us since we're little, right? Like you're already kind of dividing us in that sense, or controlling our bodies in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, like thank you for sharing that, because I do think that is something that is lost on a lot of people, especially people that aren't from like California or like the West Coast, Or
it has a negative connotation, like telling people, like I remember moving to Fresno State and doing like, what was I doing? I was running for ASI president, and I meet the president of the college, Joseph Castro, and then he said, oh, where are you from? I'm like, Compton, and he changed his face. And I was like, oh, she's bad news or something. But I'm like, why do people have that impression on people that come from the places we come from?
Yeah, so like I kind of want to follow up on that question. What was your experiences like, like going into college? Because number one, as the first person in your family to go to a university, but then also that's a pretty big transition going from like LA to like Fresno. Because for people that know. Because Fresno, you go there to the college, and like there's a lot of like agriculture, and there's like the university,
But it's funny because I ended up going to Aggie schools, so agricultural schools, right? Fresno State and the UC Davis are both like heavy, like it smells like cows, you know what I mean? Like all this stuff, right? I don't mind it, you get used to it. But the transition, I turned 15 when we moved to Fresno, so that was hard, right? Like having my quinceañera here, and then like, okay, let's move. And then we moved and we started late. It was a lot of things transition wise, but I mean, I think in Fresno I felt more supported in college, I would say, because there was a lot of Chicanos. I didn't know what Chicanos were until like I was doing my master's. So just think about that, right? So that was a lot. But I knew I was Mexican American. So I would see people like myself like speaking Spanish and like, or like switching normal, like this was our day-to-day. There was a lot of more of sense of community. So I decided to do my master's there as well, because I wanted to pursue that, and I felt supported. So I was like, I'm home, blah blah blah. But when I went to UC Davis, that's when I had a culture shock. I felt like I didn't belong. I was made to feel like I didn't belong to begin with. Like it was on purpose, like it wasn't just me feeling it. It's like, no, verbal, physical, like you don't fit in, you're not supposed to be here. So for me, that was just kind of like, I'm from California, the UC was made for students in California. Why am I being, like, I guess, forced out in a way, because that's what happens to a lot of students who are first gen students of color, Mexican American. Like, you're forced out of, like, PhD programs.
If you don't mind, like, could you tell us, like, are there any particular experiences that you could recall that, like, you made the field?
There's so many. I'm like, you know what I mean? So many.
Like trauma dumping right here on Step Off Radio.
So many. It's sad to say, but there's so many, and they come from women.
Mm.
Yeah, so for me, that was just like, are you serious? But I could tell you, like, the first years that I went to school there, I tried to find people like myself, and I did, right? I mean, you join those clubs, you go out and look for it.
Yeah, you join Mecha and, stuff like that.
You find your people, right? But then in my program, it was very, like, there was a lot of Spaniards, and, like, everyone was extremely nice. It was just the professors. There was one specifically who was just, like, she just, I don't know. There was, maybe we didn't click, I don't know. But, you had to be a professional, that's how I always think. But again, right, like, she would always make remarks and say, oh, you came here and, like, took everyone's money, saying, like, you took everyone's scholarships.
And this isn't a PhD program.
This isn't a PhD program. So, I come from Fresno State, and then while I was there, a professor, who, again, she was just kind of like, you're not going to make it in a PhD because we don't train people for PhDs. And she said it in a way that I'm like, wow, you're proud of that, to say that we don't train people for PhDs. So once I got in, she changed the way that she reacted towards me and everything. So now that I'm in the PhD, I come with this mindset of, like, okay, I had to move away from home. It's expensive to move. You know what I mean? All of these things. And it was the first time leaving home. So again, it's a lot. So I was like, I'm here to work and do my best. So I did. So then I was being reprimanded from doing good. Right? So for me, that was just kind of like, what do you want then? What type of student do you want? Yeah. That's
crazy, because I know that, like, everybody, I don't think it's any shock for, like, students of color that, it could be a hostile environment at a lot of universities, but for it to be all the way up in the PhD level,
to be, still the professor. Yeah.
That's just, that's...
It doesn't stop, regardless of your education. I think the higher you go, the more you're questioned by the wrong people.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just not paying attention to them, I would say. Because even right now, I just finished my first year as a professor in Chicano Studies to begin with, right? So it's like when people learn that, oh yeah, of course, Chicano Studies. I'm like, what does that mean?
Exactly. Like, what's that supposed to mean?
Yeah, and then we're like, oh yeah, border studies. Of course you would do border studies. So I'm like, okay, you know what I mean? But it doesn't stop. But then I do find people who will be supportive. So this is where I hold those people closer to me, right? Like my chair, she's amazing. That's why I went to New York, because of her. You know? So I think for me, that's where there's more of the nasty stuff happening, but you find the good stuff too.
Yeah.
So you just have to balance it out. But it sucks.
Just have to balance it out.
Yeah, you have to.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I feel like we have a lot of listeners who are either college students or they're entering into the college years, and I think that hearing this from you would be very powerful.
Oh yeah, I'm honest. Like when students reach out, like for mentorship or just to ask questions, I tell them straight up, this is what you're gonna encounter. Because when I did, no one told me.
Yeah. There's no roadmap.
Me a little bit of crying or something. Like
Yeah. Well, kind of leading into our next question. So, like, it goes without saying, you've done a lot of traveling, whether it's from the U.S. to Mexico or going to different, leaving home to go to different schools. As you said, you're an assistant professor of Chicano Studies at the Department of Black and Latino Studies at Baruch College in New York City. I want to ask you, what has that experience been like? Tell us a little bit about the adjustment moving out to California to the East Coast, because it is like a culture shock moving out there.
Yeah. But you know what? I was very resistant to New York, and I could explain why, right? Because I wanted to stay in Fresno, right? So I applied for a job there in Fresno State. I went and did the visit. I tell my family, like, the job search for academics, it's so different to like a regular job. Like, you don't just apply and they're like, oh, we like you, let's get you. No, it's more like, we like you and like 100 people more. And then they start like cutting down. So I made it to the final stages. But life didn't want me to stay in California. So that's where, when I visited New York for the first time, New York City specifically, and I was like, wow, like, I like this place, but I feel guilty that I like this place. Because that means I had to leave home.
Yeah.
And I took my brother with me because I knew I wanted to figure out if I wanted New York. And he saw why I wanted it. But I was like, dude, like, I like this place, but I feel guilty for wanting to leave.
What made you like New York so much?
The students, like, they're very outspoken, like, literally. They'll tell you what they're thinking. I mean, obviously the culture and, like, everything that's there, but I want to grow more as an artist, as an instructor, and that's where I know I could do it. Versus staying, like, local in California and being good, but I don't just want to be good. Does that make sense? Like,
you don't want to settle for being good. You want to be great, and you want to grow and push the boundaries.
Yeah, like, I want to see what else I can do with whatever's around me.
Yeah, because like I have two siblings that also went to school. One went to Oregon University, the other went out to Philadelphia. So they've left home. I'm the only one that stayed.
Like local.
So like, you know, that culture shock moving to like a different city is something else. What do you like the most about living in New York?
Oh my gosh, what I like walking.
Being able to like walk the places.
Because, you know, I feel like, I mean, at UC Davis specifically, you walk and you bike. So I really like that small town vibe. But in New York, you walk everywhere. Like, hate it or not, right? You have to walk to places. So I think it gives me time to, like, before I start my day at work and, like, sit and be inside, like, for the rest of the day to, like, really take in that, I'm here. And I think it allows me to appreciate it more. Yeah. At least this first year. I don't know about next year. But, you know, I really enjoy it. And going to Central Park, that's my favorite place. I just, like, if I feel overwhelmed, I'm there. Like, that's where I go.
Yeah, like everything in New York, it's either you're taking the bus, you're hopping on the subway, or you're walking there.
It's cool. I like it. It's different.
New York is like my favorite place, and I always tell people, like, I'm going to get hated on, but like if I had to choose, if someone said move to LA or move to New York, I move to New York because of just being able to like take the public transit out there.
Yeah, it's something that now that I'm driving more, right? Like I went to LA last week, and then here now I'm like, I hate traffic. I could be doing something with my time. That's what I think, right? So it's like in the train, I'm catching up on emails or not doing anything.
Exactly. I tell people all the time, it's like I would much rather spend 45 minutes on the train than 45 minutes stop and go in traffic. You know, but we love our cars out here in California.
Exactly.
So you know,
I mean, they're both great, right? But I think right now, as being young, it's okay to be in New York. I don't know about growing old there. That's how I'm like.
Yeah, maybe might be a little bit different then.
Yeah, I don't know about those stairs, but yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing your experiences in New York. So you're a researcher for the Humanizing Deportation project, and that's a community-based digital storytelling project, and it's the world's most robust qualitative archive that documents the human consequences of migration and Border Patrol in the United States and Mexico. Tell us a little bit about the project and how you came to be involved with it.
Yeah, so this project is led by my, I always like to say my advisor. I mean, even though he's no longer my advisor in the PhD program, but Robert Marquis Irwin. So he started this in 2016. And this is when I started grad school. So I remember during the summer, we got an email asking for people to like submit applications that they wanted to be a part of this program, right? Or like this group. And I was like, wow, this is cool. People can do this in grad school, especially being in Spanish, right? Because I think people have this mindset, Spanish just means teaching the language. But we do so many things, right? So I think once I saw that, I was like, oh, this is cool. I never tapped into my family's migration story. Because again, I grew up knowing my parents are, permanent residents. I had family members who are undocumented. All these little things. You grow up in LA, everyone's undocumented or permanent resident. A little bit of people are actually citizens, right? It's either their kids or...
There's a lot of mixed status within the community.
So I grew up surrounded, by this reality. So once I applied and I was like, oh, this is what we could to do. And I got it. And I was like, oh, okay. Then the first trip was to go to Tijuana. And I was like, wow, I haven't been here since I was like maybe 10 years ago. It was 2016. And the first time I went there, I was like, wow, this is the first time I'm at this border section, right? Like at the beginning of the border. And for me, that was very impactful. My dad crossed through there several times when he was younger with other people I don't want to mention, right? But like, it was like a thing that for me immigration was so natural, but I never got the chance to talk about it. Because I was more focused, like even in my undergrad and master's, I did, studies in Chilean studies, specifically people being exiled from their country after the military coup in 1973. So that was my work, right? Testimonial literature, but never border studies. It was never Mexico. It was more like Latin American studies.
Okay.
So this gave me the opportunity to tap into my own family's history, and I really valued it. But aside from that, it was like people I was meeting at the border, specifically people around my age. So when I went there, I was like 25, I believe. And for me, it was like, how is someone who grew up in similar circumstances as myself deported? Right? Like, how do we get to point A to B? And, they tell me, well, I'm undocumented, or I found out I was undocumented the moment I got arrested. And for me, that was just like, that was huge, right? Because it just shows you have this path in life. I grew up in Compton too, right? So it's like, I thought about a lot of the people I grew up with too, and then later on, reached out, I'm like, hey, this was my story too. So I think for me, it became more of a personal project, right? Like seeing all of these things at the border, family separation, the border itself too, like witnessing that for a whole summer every day, that was a lot to take in. And I think about a specific day on Father's Day, at that time, Friendship Park was open, right? So people could come on the U.S. side, and then people on the Mexican side obviously couldn't, be there. And it was just like parents, especially male, right, fathers, not being able to see their child on the other side, but like knowing they're there. So there's like a shadow, and I'm like, wow, this is so unfair, right? Like the injustice behind it. So again, like all of these little elements allow me to feel like I can, support as a researcher, but more as a person too.
Yeah. Absolutely. What was it like seeing like the militarization that we see at the border, especially like this is as the election of Trump is looming too in 2016?
It's hard, because I feel like every time I go to Tijuana, and I haven't been there since 2021, since I finished the Mural project, like it just keeps adding layers to it, either physical layers or just the mentality people have. So I started seeing more of the agents, right? I got the chance to also go to the other side, right, to Border State Park. And, I feel kind of silly saying that too, but like the agents were super kind, right? So I'm like, are they just doing their job? Do they really believe in this? I'm coming from more of a privileged space too, right? Like academic, U.S. born, and I went to the border to document it on the other side. But once you're in Mexico, it's a whole different reality. Even when we're painting the Mural project, they would just come by and ask us, what are you doing? I'm like, painting? Like, it's obvious we're painting. And they're on the U.S. side, so they really can't do much, or that's the assumption, right? So I think for me, it's just kind of allowing you to see how this border is so protected, but I ask from what? Like, who are we protecting really, right? And again, border agents are there, the cars are there, so it's just kind of like a performance, I feel. At the border, but it does have violent implications for people.
Yes, even though a lot of it is political theater, it nonetheless has very real ramifications for people and families. Following along with that, something that I've admired about your work is that you're a doctor, you're a professor, a researcher, and an academic, but at your heart you're an artist. And I believe that's exemplifying the fact that you're the director of both these mural projects, both in Tijuana and in El Paso. And tell us a little bit about that. How did you become involved and what was the inspiration behind both of those projects? Yeah,
so I could tell you it started in 2016 when I first went to Tijuana, and I saw the Deported Veterans and Distress mural, which is the upside down U.S. flag. And then on one side you see the U.S. flag, but on the other side you see the names of deported veterans from all over the world. It's not just Mexicans. So for me, seeing that, not knowing what it represented until I found out, I was like, wow, this is insane. And what do you mean deported veterans, right? And then I started asking more questions, meeting deported veterans, and for me that was it, like bridging art with a real person, right? And I was like, why don't we have more art like this at the border? Because that was the only mural that I think is actually political. Everything else is cute. And I think it's an injustice to portray cute things on the border. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Because the border in and of itself it's not just a landmark, it is a political statement. Like this is one side, this is the other. You belong on this side, you don't belong on this side.
And kind of going back to your question about Trump, right? Like he flew over Playas De Tijuana and he said, "Why is that flag upside down?" He raised it, so he basically asked Border Patrol to go to Mexico and like wipe it out. But you can't do that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And then obviously he learned about the Deported Veterans. So ignorant, of course, right? But for me, again, this idea of like bridging art with real people was really important. So that's where my critique on what the art at the border was. Like, cute hearts, it's so unfair for so many people have died, right? Like, there's actual murals and art installations like the migrant crosses that really honor the people who have been affected, like really make an impact. So why don't we have more murals like this one, right? Like the mural in distress for the veterans and other things that will really allow people to, like, maybe I should do something, versus going to the border and painting and say, I painted the border, and then move on with your life, you know? So that's what I wanted people to feel guilty to, right? Because I was bearing witness to everything that was happening at the border in the sense of humanizing deportation, right? Of like the storytellers, family separation, young kids being deported who could have benefited from DACA program, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, how do I, aside of Instagram, because Instagram became my blog space, how do I make people feel guilty, care, you know, that's the goal, but do something. And that's where I was like, you know what, let me do a mural with the same community that is, you know, telling us their stories and really allowing us to understand what it means to be deported, with criminal records, without criminal records, whatever you want to call it, you know? And that's where it happened, you know, and still to today, people still want me to continue working on these murals. So it's just like, there's a need, and why wouldn't I help with that, with what I know what to do?
You know, thank you for taking part of this project and for humanizing these stories too, because I think a lot of times when we hear about deportation, we hear X amount of people are deported a year, but we forget that, you know, behind every number there's a father or a mother or a son or a daughter, somebody you know's family member who is being deported, and there's a whole story behind that, and a family who is torn apart because of it. And I think that, you know, like part of achieving, you know, more humane immigration reform is putting a name and a human face to these stories. On top of this project, you also have done the El Paso del Norte mural project as well. And the first phase of this mural could be viewed under the El Puente Santa Fe El Paso International Bridge. And aside from being in a much different location than the Mural de Tijuana, how was the El Paso del Norte mural different? And what was the experience for you personally different?
Yeah, you know, I think this project hit me harder in the sense of emotions. So the Playas De Tijuana one, you know, I went in different stages, right? So August of 2019, that's when the first faces were painted, and then September, and then, you know, I would always go to Tijuana every time, you know, or, you know, grad school was there, but every time I would get a break, I would go and I connect people there and paint together. So that it became more of a healing process for everyone, right? And it was just kind of like a way for us to connect. But the El Paso del Norte mural project came to me like quick. Last fall, specifically like around November, when I met Estela Juarez, who wrote a children's book called Until Someone Listens. So I taught that book in my class. I invited her virtually and her mom, Alejandra, and I was like, this is horrible, right? Like the situation that they're facing, family separation. The mom had already been deported. Estela went with her as a young kid to Mexico. She faced her own challenges, you know, being U.S. born and then taken to Mexico, language and all that stuff. And I was like, why am I not doing anything to help them, right? Knowing that I know I could do something. That's the thing. So that's where I was like, you know what? Let me see what I can do. And I applied to a grant at my new job, and I got it. So I was like, okay, we're going to do this mural project. And it worked out, right? And along the way, I realized I was listening to so many stories, many of them not even in the archive yet, in Humanizing Deportation. Others like Annie Garcia, I would follow her on YouTube back in the day, and then on TikTok she came up, and I was like, Annie is someone that I followed her story, and then I'm like, how do I pull her in to be a part of these other stories, right? Like, she's representing someone who is not in the archive yet. So all of these stories are there, are present, and I'm like, let me put them all together. So I think even though mostly people are interested in the Playas De Tijuana mural project, I think because of its location, it's so visible. El Puente Santa Fe invites you just to see it as it is, raw, and like we painted next to like dead birds, like literally like by the line, you know, the invisible line in the river, no river, you know, it's just kind of like, it was harder to be down there than in Playas De Tijuana.
You've seen the border at different points in the U.S., and I think that like there's a lot of people who are not in border communities, that they have no perception at all what it's like at the border. What do you think is the biggest thing that people who aren't from border regions get wrong about it?
So first of all, people don't think there's a border. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think people think that Trump built all of the new border walls. I'm like, no, like, please go on Google and like see there's border walls since like Clinton, first of all, right? Like, they don't look the way that they look now, right? But I think that's one of the misconceptions, and I argue with people online, which I don't want to do, and I'm like, read this book, and they don't do it, right? So it's kind of like, the evidence is there, but they choose not to see it. The second thing is that I think there's people crossing every day, like hopping the border. I'm like, no, there's not. That's not how it happens. You might see it in Playas De Tijuana, it's very visible. But I think people forget that it looks like a war zone, and that's the feeling that I got in Ciudad Juarez, specifically where we were at by the 13th door. Under Puente Santa Fe, I felt like we just came after, a fight happened, and then this is what was left behind, and we were just there with the art. So I think people forget, like, this is a real space that you can access, especially on the Mexican side. It's easier to like be near the wall and touch the wall. On the U.S. side, it's more patrolled. Like, there's more invisible lines that you can cross, and border patrols there. Like at the beach in Playas De Tijuana and San Diego, you can't be near anymore. So I think that's where, I feel like there's so many things people can do to really see how it is, but they choose not to because it won't benefit the idea or narrative that they want to like enforce.
It's purposeful ignorance. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Whatever helps them sleep.
Exactly right. As stated before, you're an avid artist, you paint, you do photography, and you even dabble a little bit in poetry as well. Can you share how art has been instrumental in being a grounding force in your journey as a cultural worker and a disciplinary scholar, and also how art has the power to be a galvanizing force in revolutionary movements?
Well, I always think about who has access to academia, right? Like, not everyone. Like, my parents, I take them to many of my presentations when I can, and I'm in California. But not the real person, like the normal person, day-to-day worker, doesn't have access to academia the way that academics do, right? People who are in programs or who finish their schooling. So for me, it's like, yeah, I could write this wonderful chapter that is going to get X amount of awards and God knows what. Like, I don't care about that. And I understand it's important for us to have in our like tenure track jobs, but I think it's like, what's the purpose of me writing this cool chapter that academics praise or theorize about it when real people are actually like being affected by this? So how do I bridge this, right? How do I make this side happy while actually impacting what I want to do? So I think that's where art comes in, right? And I feel like if you see a photo, right, which I think I like photography more than everything else that I do, but a photo or art piece, I invite people to paint with you, or write a poem that's bilingual, which is that's what I like to do. So I think it's like, I know my intended audience, but I don't just want to be engaged by academics, because then they box you in. But I think the public, they're like, oh yeah, she did this, or this is what she's trying to do. And that's the feedback that I get from real people, like people who are feeling all of these things at the same time, right? Of saying, they've been impacted by deportation, they get in touch and like, hey, this is my sister's story. How do I have her story be a part of a next mural? So for me, that's where I like to see art coming from, like the people and for them, but using the resources of academia and the institution.
Yeah, the art kind of humanizes it in a way that like sometimes like academia can get lost in like the numbers and the stats, and it could get very data heavy. Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of the humanity that could get lost in there. And speaking of which, humanity, which constantly gets lost at the border, 2024 has proven to be a particularly deadly year along the border. In fact, it seems like every time I have a question like this, every year has been the deadliest year on record. We've also seen the Biden administration restrict asylum seekers' ability to present themselves at ports of entry for asylum. Aside from the obvious militarization of the border, which you can see with your own eyes if you go down there, what do you foresee being the biggest hurdles undocumented people face, especially with the potential of a second Trump term looming in November?
Well, like Trump says that he wants to support everyone, and I'm like, well, good luck with that, because we don't have the manpower for that. Like, we could do it if we wanted. We have that in the past, right, in the U.S. history. But I think one of the biggest things people have to worry about, like if you're undocumented specifically, is the hate that someone like him represents, right? So I think this is where we can't forget that, yes, policy will impact people, but the fact is that it's the sentiments, right? Like the regular person that could actually feel empowered to do something towards a community. And we saw it during COVID, right, towards a specific community. For Mexicans, unfortunately, we become the scapegoat, right?
Yes.
And of like, oh, undocumented then, right? Even with Biden, we're not safe. He used the word illegals, right? So again, he's just echoing his true sentiments, right? He was a part of the Obama administration, deporter-in-chief. So we're not safe with either or. It's just the fact is that I think Trump is more blunt about it.
Yeah.
And his followers are too. And I think, he has Latino followers. I have friends who are deported for Trump, right? Like, they love Trump and they feel like he's going to do something for them, but they're deported. So I think this idea of like who he represents and what he couldn't do for people, it just has them brainwashed.
That's wild. Yeah, deported people for Trump. That's
like that shouldn't exist.
No, it shouldn't. Right? That's crazy.
It's there, and I wonder why. And then the question, their answer is always, "Well, he didn't deport me. It was Obama." So I'm like, okay, I get it, but he's not gonna pick you over, anyone else.
Yeah. It's like not to hurt your feelings, but you're not special. You're not gonna get
again, right? Like the idea that they think that they deserve, right? And for me, that's what gets us in trouble all the time, deservingness. Yeah,
it's very frustrating to see the so-called progressive wing of politics in this country trying to adopt Trump-light policies of the border, but like you said, though, it really is just like a representation and a manifestation of what they really at their heart believe in.
Oh yeah, and these sentiments are there, right? Have always been in the U.S. I think the way that the party system is set, it makes us think that people don't think badly about others, and they do. So I think with Trump now, it's like people are feeling more, comfortable in being out there.
Yeah, exactly. Your work stems from your interest in the intersection of race and ethnicity, immigration and policy. Are you currently working on any projects or have anything in the works that you'd like to let our listeners know about?
Yeah, so I'm currently working on 2 new mural projects, actually starting next month. So right now I'm curating the archive, meaning that I'm looking for the stories that will be a part of 2 new murals. One will be installed in New York City. The second one I'm still thinking where. I have my hopes in places specifically, like some place in San Diego or Central Valley, but it just depends what works out, right? Because all of these other projects came organically, so that's where I want to follow. But these are going to be 2 murals, one dedicated to deported veterans, and then the other one undocumented youth, like full-on undocumented. And those will have face deportation. So again, to remind people, right, this is still ongoing. Like the parole in place program that Biden just announced will not benefit any of the people that I collaborate with, no one. So I think people forget about that, right? It's like, yes, and I mentioned this earlier to another a journalist. He asked, what are the pros and cons about this parole in place? And I'm like, the cons is that unfortunately the law is retroactive sometimes, right? Like IRA 1996, that meaning you have a criminal record, it will affect you, regardless if that happened years ago. But a new policy like this won't be retroactive for people who have already faced deportation. So I think for me, this is where it's important to acknowledge the fact that we're always moving forward, but not acknowledging the past, right? Like the people who have stood to today being affected by it. So I think, yes, it's good for the small number of people who are going to be benefited from this, but at the end of the day, there's a larger problem, and this is where the murals come in.
Dr. De La Cruz, thank you so much for joining us on the show. We truly appreciate you making the time to join us, and we hope to have you back on the program very soon.
No, yeah, thank you. It was really fun.
Internet's Dr. De La Cruz Santana. You can see all of her work on her social media pages, which we will list at the end of this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. And with that said, Internets, we out. Peace.